11:28 p.m. There are certain men who seem to have been born for the spotlight. Men who walk into a room and rearrange it simply by existing. Rod Stewart was one of those men, and for the better part of 6 decades, the world watched him live out loud. The music, the women, the stadiums, the scandals, the marriages that rose and fell like tides. He was larger than life and seemingly untouchable. But there is a version of Rod Stewart that never made it into the headlines. A quieter version, a man sitting alone with his memories, letting himself feel the weight of a name he has never quite been able to put down. And when he finally said it out loud, when he finally admitted in an interview what he had been carrying for years, the people who heard understood immediately why it hit so hard. Because it was not just a confession about a woman. It was a confession about the man he became too late. Before any of that can make sense, you have to go back. All the way back. Because Rod Stewart's story does not begin with fame. It begins with a family that loved him almost too well. He was born on January 10th, 1945 in Highgate, North London, the youngest of 5 children in a household that ran on warmth, football, and music. His father was a steady, hard-working man. His mother held the family together. And Rod, the baby, the golden one, was spoiled with attention in the way that youngest children often are. He would later describe those years as genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. And that happiness, as strange as it sounds, set a trap for him. Because when you grow up never truly lacking anything, you spend the rest of your life struggling to recognize what you have before it disappears. 2 obsessions took root inside the Stewart house. The first was football, and Rod was genuinely gifted. Competitive, aggressive, fast on his feet, people around him believed he had a real future in the sport. The second obsession was music, and it arrived the moment he first heard Little Richard. Not gently, not gradually. It hit him like a door blown open in a storm. His father bought him his first guitar without fully understanding what he was handing his son. A direction, a destiny, something that would outlast everything else. At 15, Rod made the kind of decision that frightens parents and thrills teenage boys. He dropped out of school and tried for a professional football career instead. He had a trial with Brentford FC. He told himself it went well. He told himself they were interested. Years later, he admitted the truth. They never called him back. Not once. No letter. No phone call. Not even a polite no. Just silence. The kind of silence that either breaks a person or sharpens them into something harder. Rod chose to be sharpened. He turned fully toward music. Not because he had a plan, exactly. More because music felt like the only world where the lifestyle he actually wanted, the parties, the late nights, the restlessness, could coexist with ambition rather than destroy it. He was honest about that, even later in life. He wanted the freedom. He wanted the fun. And he thought music might be the one path that would let him have both. The early years were anything but glamorous. He worked at his father's newspaper stand, hauling papers through London's early mornings. He drifted through jobs that seemed to have no logical connection to each other. Screen printing, which ended quickly when he discovered he was colorblind. Electrical apprenticeships. Picture framing. Eventually, Highgate Cemetery. And then, in one of the stranger chapters of his young life, a stint working inside a funeral home. He was surrounded by silence and grief every single day, still carrying inside him this wild, unshakable belief that he was meant for something the world had not yet given him. He never let go of music through any of it. At 16, he auditioned for legendary producer Joe Meek, a name that meant something real in British music at the time. This was supposed to be the moment everything changed. Instead, Meek listened to Rod sing, stormed into the recording room, covered his ears, and screamed at him to stop. It was the kind of humiliation designed to send a young man home for good. But history later revealed something interesting about Joe Meek's musical instincts. He also passed on David Bowie. He dismissed the Beatles entirely. Whatever his talents as a producer, his judgment of talent was catastrophically wrong, and Rod Stewart is one of the clearest pieces of evidence. He drifted into London's counterculture after that. Anti-nuclear marches, beatnik circles, communal living, restless nights, borrowed energy. He later admitted with a laugh that his main motivation for attending those protests was simply to meet women. And in 1962, at 17 years old, inside a nightclub, he met one. Her name was Susanna Buffy. She was an artist, and what began between them moved fast. The way things do when you are young and the city feels electric and the future seems far enough away that it cannot touch you yet. Then Susanna told him she was pregnant. What followed is the chapter of Rod Stewart's life that his public image has never quite known how to hold. He walked away, backed by his family. Supported in his decision to step back, he left Susanna to face everything entirely on her own. She was evicted by her landlord the moment he discovered she was unmarried and expecting. She ended up in a home for unwed mothers, performing hard physical labor in exchange for shelter. She gave birth alone at Whittington Hospital in November 1963. A daughter, a girl who would be placed for adoption and given a life somewhere else, far removed from the man whose name she had no reason yet to know. Rod did appear after the birth, but not to step up. He arrived with a proposal that said everything about where he was in his own development as a human being. He asked Susanna to give the baby up so that the two of them could simply carry on as if nothing had happened. She eventually did place the child for adoption, not for his sake, but because she had no other real choice. And the little girl, who would eventually find her way through life under the name Sarah, would grow up with a photograph of Rod Stewart on her bedroom wall. A famous face. A stranger, a secret she did not yet know was hers. Decades later, Rod released a song called Brighton Beach and described it as an homage to a real woman from his past. He wrapped their story in soft, nostalgic feeling. Romantic light, a kind of beautiful sadness that suggested star-crossed lovers separated by forces beyond their control. When Susanna heard it, she was furious. Her memory of Brighton was not romantic. It was the place where her world had shattered. The song, in her view, erased everything that actually happened and replaced it with a story Rod found easier to carry. That tension between the way Rod Stewart remembered his past and the way the people he left behind experienced it would follow him through his entire life. He threw himself deeper into music. He buskied. He traveled through Paris and Barcelona, living as close to nothing as a young man can get without disappearing entirely. In Barcelona, authorities decided he looked too much like a vagrant to be permitted to stay and had him deported. He came back to London, picked up a harmonica, landed a spot in a band called The Dimensions, and found himself sharing stages with the Rolling Stones. He stood backstage and watched Mick Jagger hold a crowd of thousands with nothing but his presence. And something inside Rod Stewart settled into absolute certainty about what he wanted his life to look like. In 1964, he was still busking at Twickenham Station when folk musician Long John Baldry walked past, stopped, and listened. Baldry heard something in Rod's voice. He invited him to join his band, and from that moment forward, the trajectory began shifting in the direction Rod had always believed it would. He moved through the Jeff Beck Group, joined Faces in 1969, and built a solo career at the same time. A grinding, exhausting, parallel existence that most artists would have found impossible to sustain. Rod thrived on it. And then, in the 1970s, everything detonated. Songs like Tonight's the Night and Do You Think I'm Sexy did not just make Rod Stewart famous. They made him iconic. Sold out arenas. The kind of wealth that does not feel entirely real. A social life that read more like mythology than biography. And women. An almost legendary procession of beautiful, striking women who moved through his life with a kind of dizzying frequency. There was Britt Ekland, the Swedish actress whose fire and energy ran directly underneath his biggest American hit like a current. There was Joanna Lumley, who later mentioned with amusement that she had absolutely no idea who he was when they first met. And then there was Alana Collins, whom he married in 1979 and had 2 children with, before dismantling the marriage by beginning a relationship with Sports Illustrated model Kellyanne Berg while still very much a husband. Alana later described the end of that marriage as something that broke her entirely. The fact that Berg was 15 years younger, she said, only made the wound feel worse. Rod, in his own words, acknowledged that he had always handled endings badly. He was, by his own admission, a coward about those moments. He ran toward the next thing rather than facing what he was leaving behind. The pattern was impossible to miss by then. Tall, blonde, glamorous, young, and always moving on before the current chapter had time to properly close. Then came Rachel Hunter. And Rachel Hunter changed everything, including, eventually, the way Rod understood what love had actually cost him. They met in Los Angeles in the late 1980s at a nightclub. She was 21 years old and already in a relationship when they first encountered each other. She was a New Zealand model, striking, confident, full of a kind of radiant ease that Rod later said he had never quite encountered before in the same way. She was 24 years younger than him. His family had quiet reservations from the beginning. People around him looked at the age gap and said things carefully, the way people do when they already know what they believe but do not want to say it too directly. Rod heard none of it. 3 months after meeting her, they were married. And for years, he would say that what he felt for Rachel Hunter was different from everything that had come before it. Not just because she was beautiful, because she made him want to be different. He was faithful to her throughout their marriage, consistently, genuinely, in a way that had never been true of any previous relationship in his life. They had a daughter, Renee, in 1992, and a son, Liam, in 1994. He believed, for the first time with complete sincerity, that he had found the version of himself he had always been capable of becoming. Then in 1999, Rachel walked away. She was exhausted. The noise of the life, the relentlessness of the public existence, the emotional weight of being married to someone whose world was always a little too large for any one person to comfortably live inside. It had worn her down in ways she had quietly absorbed for years. She wanted something quieter, something smaller, a life that felt like it actually belonged to her. Her leaving broke Rod Stewart in a way that very little in his life had managed to before. He later spoke about those months after the split with the kind of careful honesty that only arrives long after the rawest pain has passed. 6 months of emptiness. He joked about it, the way he joked about most things. But the people close to him saw something that the jokes were designed to conceal. He had done everything right this time. He had stayed. He had been faithful. He had built something real with someone he genuinely loved. And she had still left. Not because of anything he had done wrong, but because of the world he had spent 30 years constructing around himself. A world so loud and so relentless that even a woman who loved him could not find enough quiet inside it to stay. His bass player had actually held onto a photographer's phone number for 6 full months after the split. The photographer's name was Penny Lancaster. The bass player had decided Rod was not ready. He had watched his friend closely enough to know that throwing him straight into another relationship would not be kindness. Rod later said his bandmate was almost certainly right. When he finally did meet Penny, something felt different again, grounded in a way that surprised him, stable in a way he had not fully expected. She was tall, confident, warm, and she possessed a quality that Rod had not always known how to value before. She did not need his world to be larger than it already was. She was comfortable inside her own. They married. They had 2 sons together. And for the first time in what had been a long and genuinely chaotic romantic history, Rod Stewart settled into something that looked, from every angle, like peace. But then 2007 arrived, and with it, something that even peace could not fully contain. He was working in a Los Angeles recording studio when a call came through from the front desk. A young woman was downstairs. She was saying she was his daughter. Rod's first instinct was skepticism, the kind of caution that famous people develop after years of encountering those who want something from them. He sent his bandmate Jim Cregan down to assess the situation before he would consider meeting her himself. Cregan came back up, and the expression on his face said everything before a single word did. She looked exactly like Rod Stewart. Her name was Sarah. She was the daughter he had walked away from in 1963, the one he had asked Susanna Buffy to give up so that they could carry on dating as if a life had not been placed between them and a decision. Sarah had not had an easy path. She had struggled with addiction. She had lived through grief. She had learned the truth about her biological father from her adoptive parents after the death of her adoptive mother, and she had gathered herself and reached out. She had spent her entire childhood with his face on her bedroom wall, a famous stranger whose connection to her she had no way of understanding until it was finally explained. Their early meetings were awkward in the way that meetings carrying 40 years of silence and unasked questions are always going to be. There was no clean narrative, no simple reconciliation, just two people who shared something enormous sitting across from each other and trying to find the language for it. Slowly, carefully, over time, Sarah became part of the wider Stewart family. Not without complication, not without history, but present, known, acknowledged. And all of it, Susanna, Sarah, the years of moving on without looking back, the marriages, the patterns, the endings he handled badly, came to sit very quietly beneath the surface of a recent interview Rod gave with the Times. He was reflective in the way that men sometimes become when they have lived long enough to see the full shape of the choices they made. He talked about the chaos. He talked about the women he had loved and left. He talked about the way time makes certain things clearer, even as it puts them further out of reach. And then he talked about Rachel Hunter, not with bitterness, not with anger, with something quieter and more difficult than either of those things. He talked about how the end of that marriage had wounded him in ways he had not let himself fully show at the time. He talked about the months of emptiness that followed. He talked about the age gap his family had always worried about, and about the way Rachel herself had eventually come to understand and say aloud that her youth had played a central role in why things ended the way they did. Two people moving in directions that the years between them had always made inevitable, even when the love was real. Underneath all of it, one truth settled at the center of everything he said. Rachel Hunter was the woman Rod Stewart believed he should never have let go, not because she was perfect, not because their marriage was without its difficulties, but because she was the relationship where he had finally shown up as the version of himself he had spent his whole life failing to become. He had been faithful. He had been present. He had done the things he never did with anyone else before her. He had become, for the first time, the man the woman beside him actually deserved. And she had still left. She had left not because of who he was in that marriage, but because of everything he had built before she arrived. A world too vast and too consuming for the quiet life she needed to breathe inside. There's a particular kind of grief in that. Not the grief of someone who caused their own loss through recklessness or selfishness. That grief, at least, comes with an explanation that the person carrying it helped write. This was something different. This was the grief of a man who finally did everything right and lost anyway, who arrived at the version of himself he had always been capable of being, and found that he had arrived just slightly too late for the person who mattered most to be able to stay. Rod Stewart found real love with Penny Lancaster, something lasting, grounded, genuinely good, the kind of partnership that holds rather than fractures. He built a family that continues and endures. He found his peace. That is not nothing. That is, by any honest measure, more than a great many people manage. But when the concerts are finished and the lights go down and the noise of the world finally quiets enough to let a man hear his own thoughts, it is Rachel Hunter who surfaces. Not as a ghost, not as a wound, as the answer to a question he has spent years turning over in his hands. What might have happened if they had found each other 10 years later, when the distance between them was smaller, when the life she needed and the life he offered had more room to meet in the middle? He does not know. He can't know. No one can. What Rod Stewart knows is what he has said out loud, carefully, honestly, with more vulnerability than rock legends tend to allow themselves in public. He got it right with her. He became a man he should have been years earlier, and it still was not enough to make her stay. That is the story underneath the story. Beneath the decades of bright lights and sold-out nights and the romantic chaos that made him one of the most written about men of his generation. Beneath the confessions and the children and the marriages and the long, complicated reckoning with his own past. Underneath all of it, one quiet, aching truth sits waiting. Even when you finally become the person you were always supposed to be, the clock does not rewind. The years you spent becoming are years the people you love were also spending, growing, changing, needing things you were not yet able to give. And sometimes by the time you are ready to give them, those people have already quietly found their way to a door, and what you see when you look at them is not goodbye, but the gentle and inevitable shape of a life that has outgrown yours. Rod Stewart stood at that door. He saw Rachel Hunter walk through it. He understood, eventually, exactly what it meant. And he carried it forward into the life that came next. A good life, a full life, a life he is grateful for. But a life that holds, somewhere inside it, the permanent and human ache of the one he could not keep. The one he had finally, truly earned. And maybe that is the most honest thing that can be said about any of it. Not that love failed him, but that he arrived at love. Real love, faithful love, present love, and found that the time for it with her had quietly already passed. That the man he became was exactly the man she had needed. Just not quite in time.